right, you're listening to Hawk Talk. I'm here today with Tim Armstrong. How are you?
Eric, good to see you. I love your logo, by the way.
Thank
It's
you.
one of my
Appreciate
favorite
it.
logos.
When we started, it was about figuring out how we can make it almost a religious symbol that people would want to like feel it and rock it and wear it. And it seems to have worked out that way. So yeah, to take it all the way back, I assume the day you're born, you come out of the womb, you're in the delivery room and you start trying to figure out how to bring everything online. It's time to digitize this place. Like from the beginning, you were into computers and the internet, right?
Yeah, day one.
Day one. Perfect. And the interview's over. Great. No, but let's start from the beginning. Where are you from originally?
I grew up in a town called Littleton, Massachusetts, which is 7,000 people, one stoplight kind of towards western Massachusetts.
Nice.
And it was famous for one thing, which is a juice company called Very Fine Juice.
Yeah.
And other than that, people generally don't know Littleton.
And so one stoplight for 7,000 people feels like that's pretty busy.
Yeah, by the way, if you went to the stoplight, you'd be busy.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a very, very small town. You kind of knew everybody in town.
Yeah.
Half houses and half farm.
What were your parents doing? What were their professions?
Yeah, my dad was a Vietnam vet. He came back. He went to Boston College, went to Vietnam, served kind of like he was on a PT boat, almost like Apocalypse Now, if you've seen that movie. So he was dropping long-range Marines off of the DMZ. And he came back, went into the tech sector, actually worked at IBM and then Digital Equipment Corporation, which is DEC. And then he ended up getting into the healthcare sector as CTO at a place called New England Rehab, which was bought by Health South, which is the big company that had the giant financial blow up. He was essentially in product and tech his whole career after coming back from Vietnam.
Is that what he studied, or how did he end up in that?
Basically, IBM was hiring a lot of military vets back then because they were well-trained and disciplined. And so he ended up going to IBM directly out of the military. And I think that was one of those great IBM programs where a lot of people like my dad got a shot getting into a career track.
Yeah.
After, most in our generation, because a lot of people didn't serve, a lot of people went direct college to jobs, but he had to stop off in Vietnam for a couple of tours and came back to IBM. And then my mom actually started as an assistant at a publishing company and then became the head of HR. And she was the head of HR there for a place called Penwell Publishing. That was out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but they had a place in Boston and Hampshire.
Nice.
And so I grew up around the dinner table kind of talking about business and hearing stories from HR and my dad's stuff from the tech industry. So that was a good little training ground.
I was going to say, this is already starting to make sense where you have the dad in tech and technology and then mom in publishing and people. Like, I wonder how that all adds up. And so what were your interests growing up? Like if you were a 5-6-year-old and asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like what were the aspirations?
I was super interested in sports. Like I really loved hockey and I played hockey. So I think it was a lot of sports related things. And then I was always interested in business, even from a young age. So when I got into, I don't know, it was probably 4th grade, I actually took over my parents' basement and opened up a hockey store to sell hockey equipment with a friend of mine from the neighborhood. And so I think basically sports and business, even from a really young age, is what I paid attention to. And school too, but I would say I was like much stronger on the personal interest than the school interest.
And how did that progress? Like high school age, were you still into business and sports and that was the focus?
Yeah, I basically in high school kind of changed things for me a little bit. Ended up going, my parents, we were not wealthy growing up. And we all went to a place called Lawrence Academy in Groton, Massachusetts. We were day students, but it was half day, half boarding school. And at that school, I had some super impactful teachers that got me very much on more academic track. So I think my interest started to span a much wider variety of interest outside of, I still would like read every biography I could get my hands on. I still do today. I read lots of books and my love for reading kind of developed a lot in high school. And then sports, I was on a bunch of the sports teams at that school and they had really good sports at that school. So it was a lot of fun. And then a couple teachers, there was one named Doc Richardson who took me under his wing. He was the retired dean of Yale's English school who happened to show up there in retirement, just continued teaching. And I got really interested in kind of publishing and in content. I worked for him one summer actually at his house. And I worked actually with Steve Hines, who's a NHL player who ended up going to play in the NHL. So it was a fun summer of both learning from somebody really highly educated and Doc. And I think both Steve and I had a good experience with Doc that summer just because he would give us a lot of lessons in life while we were working at on his property. He had just built a house and we were doing a bunch of manual labor, but he would also have lunch with us every day and give us advice in life. And some of the advice he gave, I still remember, I still think about all the time.
So what was like the biggest impactful thing you can remember?
One thing he said, one day we were wrapping up a hose. And if if you've ever wrapped up a hose before, if you fight it, it gets all tangled up. And, one thing he said is, I think he used a Thomas Jefferson quote. I think he said, everything in life is meant to be taken by a smooth handle if you let it be taken that way. So he said, let me show you how to wrap the hose up. So the natural way that the hose has a natural bend in it. And after he taught us how to do it, he just said, you're going to encounter a lot of things in life that could get tangled up. And your job is to find the path of how to wrap something up in a way that's very smooth. And I haven't done that every time in my career, but there's many cases where that advice has gone right to the forefront of my mind when I'm dealing with a sticky situation.
Love it.
And it was a great piece of advice.
And so did you start to formulate like where you wanted to go to college, what you wanted to study during that period, or how was your kind of forward-looking side of things?
Yeah, it was interesting. In high school, I got better and better as an athlete as high school went on. So by the time I got into my senior year, our basketball team, I think we started the year off kind of ranked nationally in private schools for basketball. So I started to get a little bit of incoming interest there. And then I really liked lacrosse a lot. And so by the time I got done with my senior year in lacrosse, I also got a little bit of interest from the lacrosse schools and some Division I schools. And one school I got in touch with, I wanted to go as a walk-on and see if it was a very good lacrosse school. And so I got into the school, was planning on going to try to walk on to the team. And my athletic director and coach, my mom had called him and said, if Tim goes to that school, I won't mention the school, it'll be too big of an environment for him. If he wants to play lacrosse, let's get him into a smaller school. So I ended up, even though I had gotten into the school I wanted to go to, I went down to visit Connecticut College, which is a very small Division III school in Connecticut. And a guy who I grew up with, who was kind of like a mentor to me, and his younger brother was one of my best friends growing up, was the captain of the lacrosse team. And he was a senior there. And so I went down and spent the weekend with him and met all the guys on the lacrosse team and had a lot of fun. So I essentially switched my whole perspective to go from a really large Division I school to Connecticut College kind of in one weekend. And one thing I've had an ability to do my whole life is the coach I had in high school had a big impact on me. And I found one thing during my life is when there's people I trust who are good at giving advice and have good judgment. I don't know how I was born with this, but I've kind of always followed that advice. So I made the switch to go to the smaller school, and it made a huge difference. I ended up playing lacrosse. I ended up rowing crew actually on the team for the first year also, and had a great experience at that school. I have great friends from that school and still stay in touch. I've been a trustee there in the past, and it was probably one of the best decisions that I made, but I really credit my mom and athletic director and coach for that decision.
Awesome. And so what did you study there?
Economics and sociology.
So getting close to and how'd the lacrosse go actually? Let's go there. Was that?
Oh, it was good. We ended up making it to playoffs my senior year, and I was co-captain of the team with a guy named Matt Shea, and then made the all-league team. So played in the East-West All-Star game for lacrosse, which was great. And so it ended up being like an incredible experience.
Awesome. And as you started to progress, what were you looking at professionally? Where was your mind at, like what you wanted to be at that point?
I grew up in an environment where I didn't really know many professions. Uh-huh. And the one thing I noticed when I was at school was that a lot of the kids who seemed to be really well educated and came from great places all had parents that were in financial industry. So I had a bias that I wanted to go into investment banking. And senior year, did some interviews, and I ended up basically moving to Boston and applied. I ended up getting a job at Scudder, Stevens and Clark, which was a investment company. But one thing happened to me before I went to work there is two of my teachers from high school were running this program called Exploration program that was at Wellesley College, and it had some of the wealthiest kids in the world and it had some of the poorest kids in the world. And they put them in this environment and basically taught summer school. And one of their teachers dropped out right before it started. So they called and said, would you be willing to come teach at this program in the summer? So I spent all summer teaching at this incredible program at Wellesley College outside of Boston. And then afterwards went to the bank. But one thing that happened to me during that summer was I met, like, my roommate from that program was in Dead Poets Society. He was one of the actors in Dead Poets Society. And so everyone from that program was from most of the Ivy League schools and all from different backgrounds. And it kind of opened my eyes that all these people had all these different experiences. And part of the program was the teachers all spent a lot of time together. So the whole summer I was hearing stories about all these different backgrounds from people. So I went to the investment bank, and after like 6 months, I went to my boss. I sat next to this guy named Murph, who was really good. He was amazing at our job. Like, he was by far a lot better than me. And after 6 months, I went to my boss and I'm like, I think you should fire me and you should promote Murph. And I'm like, I don't think I'm meant to do investment banking or investment. I don't really enjoy it that much, and I'm not that good at it. And Murph, if I have to compete with Murph the rest of my career, this is not going to be the career for me. So I ended up leaving the bank and I didn't know what to do, but I ended up starting a newspaper because I loved media and I love content. So I started a newspaper in Boston.
How did that, was that rooted in something? I know obviously you grew up with your mom being in a publishing company, but where did you already have experience publishing a newspaper or working at the school paper or anything?
No, I did a little bit of work at our college newspaper and wrote for the college newspaper a little bit. But to be honest with you, the thing that tipped me over is I started studying Katharine Graham at the Washington Post and Rupert Murdoch. And during college and in high school, I used to read all the business magazines, and I used to read biographies of like leaders and a lot of business people. And the one category I always liked the most were the people in media, Ted Turner, people like that. So when I left the bank, I really just took a step back and I thought, like, what are the things I'm naturally interested in? And tuna is really media and publishing. And that's what got me started there.
And so you jump in and just launch your own newspaper. How did that go?
I describe it to this day as business boot camp because I didn't have any money. And so launched it with one of my best friends from high school, a guy named Michael Dressler. And then this is where tech started to enter my life in a bigger way. I had done some tech stuff in high school and in college, but I sold all of my worldly goods, my bike, my car, my surfboard. I sold everything and bought a Quadra 650 Apple computer. And then I learned how to custom program the newspaper to be able to do pre-printing and the pre-press and all those things. So I started to actually spend a huge amount of time in terms of publishing software and partnering. And then we technically had to interface with a printer and another pre-production house. So that I kind of knew that I loved that aspect of it. But overall, the newspaper was a disaster. Like, we didn't know what we were doing. We racked up a bunch of debt, and it took us 9 months to figure out what to do. And we were basically always on the verge of bankruptcy, and we had debt going. So there were sometimes we could barely pay to get the papers out of the production plant. So it was and we only could eat what we killed. So if we didn't make money and sell ads, we didn't have any money. So it was definitely the most difficult thing I've ever done. But it's a long story. There was a competitive newspaper for our age bracket in Harvard Square. If people went to Harvard, they would know it. Mm-hmm. It was called the Square Deal. And the owner of the Square Deal used to compete with us, but he died of a heart attack. And the Square Deal did about $1 million in revenue. It was kind of for us, it was a big newspaper with big revenue. Yeah. And his wife essentially gave us the newspaper. She said, I'm calling you guys. My husband loved you guys. He was much older. He was I think he was in his 50s, but she said, my husband would want you guys to have this paper. Wow. So we ended up with 2 papers, and then we were in Harvard Square. Our office was right in the middle of Harvard Square. That was better because they had coupons in the paper, and we learned how to do direct response advertising, and it was much more successful and exciting. It was fun to be in Harvard Square with all the Harvard students.
And so how long did you do both of those for? How long were you in the newspaper business?
Did that for basically 2 years. Okay. We did kind of a year on our own and then another year with the Square Deal.
And what ended up happening?
Well, what happened was the internet. So I was in Cambridge, and another one of my friends owned a store, in Cambridge. His name was Peter Dunn. And he said, hey, do you want to come down to MIT and meet? There's a bunch, we were right down the street from MIT. He said, do you want to meet these guys here who are doing this thing called an internet browser? Do you want to meet them? You're like a tech guy and you love tech. So we went to meet with this team of folks from MIT who were on the first browser, and they pulled it up, and I saw like right away they started putting up information that was coming through the browser. And I had my whole history of doing the newspaper, knowing how hard it was. And so I started just asking a bunch of questions about how the internet worked and how browsers worked. And I left that meeting MIT and I called my dad and I said, Dad, I don't know what this internet thing is, but I'm selling the newspapers and I'm doing the internet. Yeah. And so I went back, told my co-founder, I'm like, we're first of all, we're going to put the newspapers online. And then what I just saw with the internet browser, I don't know if it's going to work or not, but it's 100 times more efficient than the newspaper. Yeah. So that's how I got into the internet, was literally that one meeting, that one day.
And how hard do you actually go and list your businesses and get it? Did you get these sold?
The newspaper, yeah. We basically sold them to the person who was doing our production work. Basically, they did production work for a whole bunch of magazines and newspapers, and they bought it from us. But I ended up in debt doing it. It wasn't a ton of debt, but we basically got a little bit of money out and then went on to the internet. I was like, basically went right to the internet.
And so what did that look like in terms of going to the internet? What did you jump into?
I started studying all the people who were doing internet things. And because I knew publishing, somebody I knew told me there's a IDG, which is the big publishing company, to be huge, the big tech publishing company. They were launching an internet magazine, a magazine about the internet called iWay. Mm-hmm. And they were like, look, they want people who know tech and know publishing. So I ended up going to work at IDG for about 6 to 9 months until I could figure out how to find a real internet company. And while I was selling to like America Online, selling ads to America Online, and a lot of the early internet companies. In my travels, I ended up at a company, at a NASCAR event. It's a long story, but I ended up at a NASCAR event. And the France family who owns NASCAR was giving a presentation about the internet. And after the presentation, nobody knew what they were talking about. I went up and spoke to them. I said, oh, by the way, I'm obsessed with the internet, blah, 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 blah. And they said to me, Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, is launching a company called Starwave that's basically starting to build internet properties, publishing internet properties. You should get in touch with them. And when I got home from that trip, being at the NASCAR event, I had a voicemail on my home answering machine from Starwave. Wow! And they just randomly, it wasn't connected to the NASCAR event. They had been calling around to figure out who had internet experience for publishing and sales. And so, anyways, long story short, I ended up flying out to Seattle and did an interview. I did 9 interviews in one day at Starwave, and they made me a job offer at the end of the day.
Amazing.
Packing up a bag, and I moved to Seattle, not knowing anyone, and showed up with a bag of clothes.
And Seattle. What was your vision? Was it just like, I'm going to ride this wave and I'll find my niche? Or was it just, did you have something specific you were going for? Like, you obviously love the internet, but what were you thinking was the outcome of all this?
I was thinking that if the internet became more and more frictionless over time, that media and publishing and advertising would probably explode. It may take a while, but I was like, the best thing I can do is go to the center of this and spend as much time as possible. So at Starwave, like we launched NBA.com, NFL.com, ESPN.com. It was called ESPN Net SportsZone.com. So I spent, my formative internet years in Seattle, and then Disney bought our company coming back to New York. But that was, when you talk about the wild, wild west of the internet, that was at the wild, wild west period. It was Yahoo, AOL, Starwave. There were 5 or 6, broadcast.com. There were like 5 or 6 kind of seminal companies, and Starwave was one of them.
Awesome. And so how was that experience? Like working with Paul Allen and going out there, and you had some experience, but
it was incredible. I mean, It was incredible for a few reasons. One is the people at the company. Mike Slade was the CEO of the company, who was really good friends with Bill Gates and all the tech luminaries and Paul Allen. And Tom Phillips, who was a big mentor to me, been a CEO at multiple internet places, was the president. I was the youngest person there at Starwave, but who got hired on the business team. And I had like an amazing, it's a long, this story could go on forever. I ended up selling the two largest deals. One of the deals was probably the largest deal that happened on the internet in that time period. I sold a multi-million-dollar deal, and most of the internet deals were probably $5,000 to $10,000. Like the IB, like the measurement, Rich Lafergie, who was the head of the IB, was my boss at Starwave, direct boss. And so I ended up going to see Rick Scott, who was a Time 100 leader. He's a senator in Florida now. He used to be the governor of Florida, but he was the CEO of HCA, which is the largest healthcare company in the world. And I cold called his office about the internet, saying that I read his earnings document, and I realized he was starting to talk about the internet. So I cold called him. His assistant put me on the phone, and I ended up flying down there 2 days later to one of the. He's the equivalent of he'd be the equivalent of one of the top CEOs in America right now if you name them off. It's the equivalent of cold calling somebody like that and getting in. I got in, pitched him a giant deal with Starwave, came home. Got a verbal agreement and a contract. And when I got back to Starwave, they didn't believe it because it was like essentially the whole deal was probably 3 times bigger than the whole company.
Yeah.
And they're like, Tim, there's no way you signed this deal. So I had to get back on a plane with my boss and fly back to Nashville and go to Rick Scott's office to have Rick Scott tell them it's a real deal. And
did he know what a big deal that was for you guys? Like, did he know that he had just made the company in that sense?
I don't know if he did. He definitely did when I had to re-show up and that.
Yeah, exactly.
But he was a really good, and ended up becoming a mentor of mine, and went to another company with him. So we ended up with a great relationship. But anyways, my experience there was truly remarkable because it was Wild Wild West. I had a lot of freedom to go figure things out. And because I had been such a hustling entrepreneur with the newspaper and those things, like I didn't have a big fear factor of trying to go off and try things and do things. So it was a very positive environment. It was also the first environment outside of the East Coast where I saw West Coast mentality of how creative tech and creative came together, which was another incredible lesson. And we worked with, some incredible engineers. Like I saw, like I could go on forever, but fantasy sports, we were doing fantasy sports on spreadsheets. And one of the guys, Jim McGee, sat down the hall from me, basically created the online fantasy, sports gaming. So things like that were happening all the time. It was incredible.
And how long were you there?
I was there for 2 years, and then Disney bought us. Disney was a big partner because we were doing a bunch of the Disney properties. When they bought us, the president of the company got moved back to New York, and he asked if I would go with him. So I ended up going back to work at ESPN's headquarters in New York, and I worked at ESPN and ABC Internet Ventures for Disney, and where I was part of Disney Interactive in New York, and that was fun because I was one of the first internet people there. So I had access to, I got to go to a lot of meetings I normally wouldn't have gotten to go to in New York and all over the place.
And so how long were you at Disney?
Disney, I was there for another 2 years. So Starwave to Disney probably was, I guess it was 4 years, maybe total, 3.5, 4 years.
Great. And so what ended up taking you out of Disney?
So when I was, Rick Scott, who was the HCA CEO, bought a company called America's Health Network, which was a cable and internet property with another guy named Todd Featherling. And they called, and because I had such a good relationship with them from HCA, they're like, hey, we would love to have you come help run this. And we're going to build up a super big internet property for healthcare and cable TV. And, WebMD was kind of big at the time. And then we were kind of building a competitive property to WebMD. And so we did the first LASIK eye surgery live on the internet. We were basically broadcasting surgeries and we had a health search engine. We built a health search engine for all health topics. And anyways, long story, I was there. That was New York and Nashville back and forth. And then we sold that company to News Corp, to Rupert Murdoch and Chase Carey. And they ended up putting together like a bunch of internet, and I think it was called News Digital Publishing at News Corp, where they bought a bunch of internet properties and tried to build like a media company. And health was one of the areas that they were going to invest in at News Corporation. So when we sold it, like I knew I wasn't going to stay at News Corp only because it was like going to be a small thing inside of their big company and they may dismantle and move some of the stuff around. So I was only there for 2 weeks after we sold it. And then I went to another startup called Snowball, which was Chris Anderson, who owns TED and did Wired, he started this company called Snowball, which was essentially buying and building internet properties like IGN, the big gaming site, and a bunch of other properties.
They're a tenant of ours.
Oh, are they really?
Yeah.
Yes. So we had IGN, and then we built up a bunch of different properties. And I kind of ran a biz dev and sales. They hired the woman named Betsy Murphy, was the publisher of Newsweek, who I worked with. And they had a guy named Mark Jung was the CEO. And Andrea, his sister Andrea, was the CEO of Avon at the time. And anyways, we took this property, put all the publishing elements together of having our own sites. We put affiliate networks around it with other sites. We sold ads. And then we created a business model where we took registration data from all of the sites and would do direct marketing to the registration data. So we went from 0 to $40 million in 1 year in revenue. And then I forget what it went from that, maybe 40 to 90 or 80. But we actually ended up taking the company public. Goldman Sachs took us public.
What year was this?
This is 2000. And I think we were the last internet company to go public before the bubble burst. So we literally went public and then the bubble burst and then it like came down. And it was my first experience where I had on paper was worth millions and maybe tens of millions, like maybe, I don't know what it was, between 10 and $30 million on paper. And it basically evaporated over the course of 6 or 9. It didn't totally evaporate, but it went away quickly. So that was about 2 years. Sounds like I did a lot of things. I did. But through all that, then I got Google called and I met Omid Kordestani, who was really the business founder with Larry and Sergey, and in New York. They were thinking about getting into ads. So I met with Omid in New York, and then I flew out and met with Larry and Sergey in California. And then the first office for Google outside of Mountain View was my apartment at 86 in Columbus in New York. So all these things sound crazy but this was all when the internet was like forming. So these things were.
I would say that's but this is what I like about what your story is like you also were in the publishing world and were one of the few people in the, print publishing world to go, oh no, this isn't good. Like I'm out and I'm going to go jump into this. And go figure, you jumped into a new industry that, some of the big and are one of the bigger players in that industry because you were there at the beginning. It's how it worked.
Yeah, it was interesting. I would say like my one lesson was all of this experience where I got into Rick Scott's office or Chris Anderson or people like that is because I was so early and because I was able to build up a reputation of knowing the industry well and doing those things, like all of those things came to me. I wasn't looking for them. And they all happened at a time period where like the next thing was possible, next thing was possible, next thing was possible. So, and then Google, I ended up staying at Google for basically 10 years. So then, the next jump in my career is like, really large 10-year blocks of doing things.
So you with Google, you helped stand up the advertising side. Tell me more about like what you did at Google.
Yeah, so at Google, there were like a few people working on ads. Google was basically a SaaS licensing company that got paid to provide search technology to other companies. And so it's a long story, but Yahoo basically bought a product called GoTo, which was a cost per click advertising model. And they were selling search also, but when they did ads, they decided to give search away for free. So Google's revenue essentially, it didn't go away because Google, even today, I think still sells search. But basically, it was clear that you weren't going to be able to build a huge SaaS business if people were giving search away for free. So the ad business, when I got there, was, I forget how much it was. Maybe it was $700,000 or something that they had been selling some basic ads on the site just because people were offering them money to do it. And then we ended up putting together a structure to put Salesforce together, worked a lot on the product stuff. So we spent a lot of time with product and engineering on building out like, how do you build an ad system on Google? And we launched the first version of Google Ads, which were like category ads. People would buy like groups of keywords together. Yeah. And then it took like a couple years or maybe 2.5, 3 years for it to really take off. I mean, revenue was growing, but then when we realized the value of every individual keyword could be monetized, we ended up launching AdWords, which was the auction-based model. And that was a big change. I think we were doing like, I forget what it was, maybe a couple $100 million in revenue. And we decided to change the entire system to an auction-based system that nobody understood. It was definitely one of the riskier business moves, but we did it. And then AdWords took a little while to take off. But once that machine got rolling and we started hiring, so I opened up sales offices and I don't know, probably 15 places around the US. And then we got Europe going. So like it took, we IPO'd probably 4.5 years after I got there, I guess. But once we got a rinse and repeat model going after 4 years, it really took off. I mean,
And
there's a
that
lot of
IPO
crazy
stuck,
stories
right?
here.
You didn't have to
What?
watch that stock dive, right? That one
No,
stuck.
no, it didn't. Although we did an unorthodox IPO and the stock probably would have been a lot more valuable if we tried to do an auction-based model
Got
on
it.
the opening. So it was, in retrospect, probably a traditional IPO would have gone through the roof. And
Yeah.
it did go up, but it was an incredible ride. I mean, the company was unbelievable collection of creative people. And I have ADHD, so I'm like very creative. And when I got to Google, I was like, these are my people. Like the first day I was on campus at work, there was one building in Mountain View. And just like 2 hours into being there, I'm like, this is the environment I really love to work in.
That's awesome. Very bright ADHD people.
Yeah.
And so 10 years in, what caused you to leave?
I went to see Jeff Bewkes at AOL. They were a big part. We did a couple big AOL Time Warner deals when I was at Google, and I got to know those executives. So he asked me to come over one day he had his general counsel there who I knew well too, Paul Capuccio. But when I got there, I thought they were going to be starting to renegotiate the deal that we had cut with them because we did like a multi-billion-dollar deal. And Jeff said to me, he was like, could you tell me right now on the spot what you would do with AOL? And I spent a lot of time with AOL and the execs there because they were a big partner of ours. So I said, look, I think there's a lot of things at AOL that are valuable. I think there's some things that aren't valuable, but I would highly differentiate the strategy at AOL away from, the super strengths of Amazon, Facebook, and Google, and like basically attack content, video, ads, and really lean into the super higher scalable, brands there. And so he said, could you draw it on a piece of paper? So I basically drew on one piece of paper what I would do with a bunch of the assets. And he said, this is exactly why I wanted to have you over today. I want you to run AOL. I want you to spin it out from Time Warner and take it public on its own. And I wasn't expecting that. So when I left, I was like, am I going to learn? I have a saying, which is learn to earn. Like that's been one of my career things. So I was like, am I going to learn more at Google in the next 10 years? Or am I going to learn more turning around a company that was like the worst merger in history and probably really hard, but I would learn more. So I went home, I called one of my entrepreneurial friends, Kenny Dichter, who is the founder of Wheels Up and Marquis Jet, the good guy at the time. And I talked to my wife about it. I called my wife before I called Kenny. But Kenny was phone call number 2. And my wife said to me, she's like, wow, you sound pretty enthusiastic, almost like you have the same voice that you had when you were deciding to go to Google. And so I went back, I talked to Omid and Larry and Sergey and Eric. I had a long meeting with Larry and Sergey, which was painful. But I just knew in my heart of hearts like that it might be a lot harder, but it was probably, for me, my life has been about doing tough things and trying to make them work and learning. And that I've always had success doing that. So that was really it. That was like, if I'm going to be the CEO of something, I might as well try to be the CEO of something really hard. And that's what made me do it.
And that lasted 10 years, huh?
Yeah. So basically I was, was inside of Time Warner for a year, spun it out publicly. We were independent for 5 or 6 years and then sold to Verizon. And then I was actually at Verizon running that asset. And then we bought Yahoo also. So, but that time period of sticking with AOL was basically 10 years.
And how did that feel? Like a couple of things, like, did you feel throughout it? Obviously it was hard, but did you in hindsight, are you glad you made the move? Was that that was exactly what I wanted to learn? Or how do you feel about that these days, hindsight?
Yeah, I'm going to say something that's like non-obvious, and I never in my life ever would have, I don't ever think I've ever even said it publicly before, but it ended up being the best thing in the world for 2 reasons. One is when I went from Google, I think we were worth 150 billion when I left, and I went to AOL, which was like basically valued in between $1 billion and $2 billion when I got there. So like seeing the culture difference between a company that went from 0 to 150 billion then seeing the opposite was really good. But the thing that AOL forced me to do was to learn about myself a lot more. Like I had super big successes at AOL and I had super big failures. And like some of my failures were like super public. And some of them were not even failures, but got spun in the press as failures. And there were times where the entire world thought AOL was going to go out of business or that I had made really bad management decisions or things like that. So, like, the most amazing thing about AOL was it taught me that the only people I should really care about are my family, friends, and the close people I work with. And I would say it was the most freeing experience I've had just in life. And we beat the S&P 500 index. All the investors who invested in AOL who stuck with it made, really kind of almost they did make 3 times their money. Yeah. And we had like an incredible outcome for the shareholders, and a lot of the employees made a lot of money also. And selling to Verizon, theoretically, that merger should have like 10x'd, but like I think that was it was a tough cultural fit, and with Verizon for a bunch of different reasons. But I don't know, it was like an experience of a lifetime, adventure of a lifetime.
Love it.
Incredibly, a lot of success, a lot of pain, but a lot of tough to replicate those type of business lessons.
Yeah, I was just saying you stuck it through, which is testament as well. And so you leave there, you get it, find AOL home and leave. What's next? What year was that?
That was end of 2018, so beginning of 2019.
Are you just chomping at the bit, ready to build something like, that was great, but I got to get to work? Or how are you feeling about it?
Well, another personal philosophy I have is I think that like I'm better when I'm working. So like a lot of people called me to do things, to join boards, other CEO jobs came up. And I realized I probably didn't want to jump into anything right away. I was already on the booking.com board, the big travel company, and had been on other boards. So I was like, I want to go do something where I thought there was a big problem in the world, and like whether or not it was successful or not, almost take the AOL mentality, which is like, just go do something really hard and maybe it won't work, but at least it'll be super interesting. And after I got over caring what people thought, like that's what the freeing thing about AOL was like, has been just to go do things that I think are really valuable and not worry about what anyone thinks about it, other than family, friends, investors, people who work here. So I decided, I looked forward 20 years and I was like, what is the most likely thing to happen in the next 20 years? And one of them was that as great as technology is and has been, that in real life is super important. Yeah. And that and I hope everybody gets to Mars someday, and I hope everybody can live in the metaverse, and I hope all those things come true because they'll probably be fantastic. But I know my life, like the most important things I do in my life are in the real world. And I scroll through my camera, I look at other people's camera photos. I always ask them this question is like, how many pictures do you have of a B2B server on your camera? Some people probably do, but I don't, even though I love tech. And so kind of went around the world during that time after I left Verizon and studied all of the future trends for offline. And I was in China, and I was there on a trip. I was at a board meeting actually, but then I did a bunch of personal travel stuff. And I went to go see some of the big internet companies like Meituan and other people like that and look at their new retail models. And they had like facial recognition. But when I was on that trip, I scanned a QR code in the street in Shanghai to buy noodles. And I was like, wow, that was frictionless. And in the US, QR codes don't seem to work that well. But China, about 80% of the Chinese economy works on QR codes. So I'm like, something must be missing. So anyways, I went back, did all the product research, and I decided that we would I had launched a company called DTX, which was direct to everything, which was going to be, how do you do real world direct to consumer? And we started testing a bunch of technology, but one of them was QR. And then I decided that why don't we figure out how to become the company that helps people directly connect from offline to online, but really be an offline company. Use all the tech of online, but like focus on offline. And that's what got Flowcode going. So DTX is the holding company, Flowcode's our product, and that's what we do today.
Love that. I did not know the origin story there. So that is compelling, and I really appreciate it. So
get out of China.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, as someone that studies the tech in China, a lot of times it doesn't bridge the gap that well. We're like live shopping, they're trying, but it's not working. Like there's a lot of different things there that don't work, but that definitely makes sense. And so 2 last questions for you. Number one, what is actually, let's start with what's next. What do you like? You're building Flowcode. What is kind of the vision of that?
I mean, we have one saying at the company, which is the product is the team and the team is the product. I think my most important next job here is to keep building all of our people
Mhm.
and the leaders here, and to bring the people in who are going to make us think differently. So I don't think I would have given this answer 10 years ago, but I think my number one job is building the best team in the world with the best talent for exactly what we're trying to do. And I think that finding people who love offline as much as they love online is kind of hard to do. So I think that's like you're one of those people I think that has a real big appreciation for both worlds, but there's not that many people. So my job is to go find those humans. And then the second thing is I think to keep like disrupting ourselves and innovating. I think that the world of AI, I was just in San Francisco last week for the week with Ron Conway from SV Angel and was at his AI conference and met a lot, talked to a lot of the big AI leaders who are big companies, but also talked to a lot of the up and coming founders. And I think AI is going to be as big as the internet, or I should say much bigger than the internet.
I agree.
So I think part of it also is like, how do we think about AI with our products? That's another big topic for what's next. And I'd love to hear your feedback on that. I mean,
Yeah, no, same page. I mean, that's we're literally looking at how does AI disrupt what we do and why aren't we building it or integrating it now? That
yeah,
is the sort of marching orders here. So last question for you. For someone that wants to achieve their dreams, wants to go for it, whether they're already on their way or however they're figuring out, what would be one piece of advice you have that you either wish you got or you did get that helped you really grind through all this?
I think you have to think about what you do as a craft. And, one of the sayings I like is most great things don't get done in under 10 years. I think it's hard in today's culture where people like almost have a mutual fund mentality where they shift around. And I did earlier in my career, but it was all on the same subject. Like I was kind of learning in the same subject line. And I think one of the things, Eric, that like, and I'd be interested if you have had this experience. I think social media has made people really short-termism and think
Mhm.
about very micro environments. And this happened, this trend, that's
Yep.
happening. Even the word trends is something that I don't think is. I think careers you should think about crafts, not trends.
Yep.
And you should put the work in. Like I know there's this famous Olympic coach who says, if you're going to be an Olympic athlete, 33% of the time you should be happy, 33% of the time you should be normal, and 33% of the time you should be miserable.
Yeah.
And like I think in our culture today, there's a lot of avoiding. Do you want to put the grind in? And I look at all the even Elon, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, Larry and Sergey, the amount I saw it firsthand at Google. I mean, the amount of grinding and that it took to be successful. And I just think I always say that to young people, which is like, think about a craft, not a career, and become really good at your craft. And that will never steer you wrong. And I know you're an unbelievable example of that. And you've been at it and you've written books.
Been a
Um,
decade.
a decade. But I think that compound, just like interest rate compounds in the bank, a
Yeah.
craft compounds for your career. And it really does. And you'd be surprised the older you get, the more people drop off because the people who did all their switching, never
Yep.
stuck with anything. It's much harder when you're later in your career to become like a real expert at something if you haven't put the time in.
Well, and it's similar to your career and mine. It's also a function of like, as you said, things came to you because people understood who you were. You stuck with
Yeah.
something. It wasn't like, I don't really know what he does. It's like, oh no, I'm very clear on what
Yeah.
Tim does. And then when we need him, we're going to call him. Like that's a
Yeah.
part of the benefit too. But I agree. It's that compounding effect of building off of it.
Yeah. Now, like, I'll ask you a question like on your book, writing your book, that's like you taking your knowledge and having to write it down. That's a hard, you can't do that if you don't have a craft.
Yeah, 100%. You can try, but no one's going to want to read it. But yeah,
Right.
no, and frankly, if you do have a craft, it's not hard. Like it was not hard to write that book because all I had to do was put an outline together and then fill it in because it was stuff I did every day.
Yes. I think that's the secret sauce to life. It's probably the same. I mean, it's kind of like being a parent also.
Yep.
Parenting is kind of craft. You have to work at it. There's no, I wish there was a little cheat codes for it, but there's
Yeah.
not.
Amen. Well, Tim, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on Hawk Talk.
Awesome. Thank you.